When I was in grad school, one of the requirements for graduation was showing proficiency in a second language. This was totally fine. I had been learning Spanish since the first grade. But the way the university had us demonstrate this proficiency was interesting. We didn't have to pass a language course, we didn't have to write an original essay, and we didn't have to take a traditional multiple choice exam. All we had to do was successfully translate a text from one language into another. Translating between languages is trickier than it seems. To give you an example, imagine you wanted to translate the following English sentence into some other language. It's raining cats and dogs. Now, imagine that the language you're translating this sentence into does not have that same idiom. How would you go about making a translation? Do you stay true to the original words, literally translating them one at a time? It is raining cats and dogs? You might think this is the most straightforward thing to do, but if the language you're translating into doesn't have that idiom, then what would that sentence mean to speakers of that language? Would it even remotely convey the same thought? Or would it be nonsense, just sound like some joke? Okay, you might say, fine. You don't actually translate sentences word for word. What you try to translate, instead, is their sense, their deeper meaning. Sure, maybe the language you're translating into doesn't have that exact idiom, but suppose it has one similar enough that it essentially means the same thing. It's raining heavily outside. So, okay, fine. Let's translate "it's raining cats and dogs" into whatever corresponding idiom the second language has. But now there's another objection to be made. You didn't actually translate what the original English speaker said. You changed their words, altered their syntax, and created a sentence they never actually uttered. The sentence you presented in the second language was never, exactly, spoken in English. It's an invention of your own translation, something you foisted onto us out of thin air. You see the issue, right? This is the sort of thing translators deal with all the time. Translation is a creative act. It's also an extremely difficult one. This video is about adaptation, not translation, but I think the comparison holds, at least as a framing device. Literature and film, you might say, are two distinct languages, each with their own grammar structures, conventions, and communicative gestures, and to adapt a novel into a film inevitably means having to encounter the same insurmountable differences that translators face. One of the things I love about reading, for example, is that it allows me to inhabit a space of what I might call imaginative possibility. A scene is described to me on the page, let's say, two siblings running around a big grassy field. I'm given all sorts of physical descriptors. The grass is green, there are clouds in the sky, there's a big oak tree with a swing hanging from a branch. And yet the way that I envision these things in my mind is completely up to me. Sure, the grass is green, but how tall is it? How broad is the field? There are clouds, yes, but how many, and of what shape? What arcs do they trace through the sky and the wind? And exactly how tall is that oak tree? What color is the swing? Whenever I encounter a description like this, what I imagine is the wide expanse of open land behind my grandparents' house, where my sister and I spent a great deal of time playing in our childhoods. Obviously, another person wouldn't envision the same thing. I could go on, but you see my point. This phenomenon, this thing that I called imaginative possibility, is simply endemic to literature. It's one of its great features, one of its natural characteristics. I am given things to envision, and yet I'm free to envision those things as I see fit. Film, of course, works differently, because it supplies us with the image. Things look precisely the way they're presented on screen. By replacing words with images, movies condense the possibilities, otherwise seemingly infinite, down to one tangible reel. Cinema collapses the wave function. It takes me out of the freedom of my own mind and gives me something concrete, undeniable. Imaginative possibility, you might say, is not an idiom that film shares. My point is that, in adaptation, as in translation, certain changes are inevitable. The differences of the languages in question mean that some things will inevitably be altered. But what I'm much more interested in, and what I'd like to focus on in this video, are the active, willful choices on behalf of filmmakers adapting novels for the screen. I'm not so much interested in the changes that happen naturally, but instead in the alterations that filmmakers choose to make, the ways they take a text and modify it, reconstruct it for their own purposes, according to their own vision. I'm interested in why these choices are made, what ends they ultimately serve, and what else is amended in the process. Now, obviously, this is a massive topic, one that could be discussed almost endlessly. So rather than try to address it in general, this video will instead provide a case study of one specific example. What I'd like to talk about is Kazuo Ishiguro's novel Never Let Me Go and its 2010 adaptation into film. Before we get into the weeds of everything there is to discuss, and trust me, there's a lot, let me start with an immediate caveat. I am a reader at heart, and I want to be forthright with the fact that I do prefer the novel over the movie. I think this novel is transcendent. I think it's beautiful and compelling, and I think, as a work of art, its film adaptation doesn't even come close. In fact, part of the reason I chose to talk about this novel and its film counterpart is because I knew it would give me an excuse to reread the novel. But the reason I'm telling you all of this is not because I'm going to try to convince you of my view. Yes, I have my preferences, but this will not be the kind of video where I try to prove to you that the movie is bad, where I argue that the book is always better than the movie, or where I try to say that if you prefer the film, you're somehow wrong. Instead, I simply want to understand how this adaptation works, where it stays true to its source material and where it differs, and what implications these differences hold for us as both readers and viewers. So, this will not be an evaluative video. If you prefer the movie, that's fine, and in fact, I'd love to hear why that is. All I want to do, for now, is talk about this story. I want to tell you why I love it and what it means to me. I want to examine the ways the film takes that story and changes it, and I want to think about how these changes pattern our experience of its major themes. So, without further ado, let's talk about Never Let Me Go. Obviously, there will be spoilers ahead, so proceed with caution. I'm going to do something a little counterintuitive here and start by talking about the movie. I say counterintuitive only because the novel, of course, came first, so you might think I should start there, but for the purposes of this video, I think engaging with the movie earlier makes sense. I'm not even going to present you with an argument, at least not yet. Right now, I just want to get some things established. How does the movie work? What are its major preoccupations? And what, exactly, is the story it wants to tell? The film starts at the end with a frame narrative. We see Kathy, our narrator, standing before the window of an operating room. Behind and around her are the sounds of a hospital, the beeping of electrocardiograms, the implicit shuffling of doctors' feet. And, through the window of that room, we see a young man lying on an operating table. His name is Tommy, and he, like Kathy, is one of the three main characters in this story. As he lies there shirtless on the table, we can see the scars that line his torso, but for the moment, we aren't told what they mean. They seem to stand for something dark, something sinister, but their significance isn't elaborated for the time being. We simply see them demarcated there, a strange pattern in his flesh, suggestive of something more. From this scene, the movie quickly shuffles backwards in time, taking us right back to the beginning of it all. We now find ourselves at Hailsham, a posh English boarding school where our three main characters, Kathy, Tommy, and Ruth, are students. As students, they engage in all the sorts of activities you'd expect students their age to enjoy. They play with dolls, they play sports, they make art, they gossip. And it is in this stage of the film that we start to learn something of these students' personalities. Tommy, we learn, is a boy compelled by powerful emotions. He has, as another character will later say, a big heart and terrible rages. He's picked on by the other children, and he throws massive, savage fits as a result. But Kathy, from a young age, takes a liking to Tommy, and she seeks him out to become his friend. We first see this happen one day when the boys are picking teams to play soccer. Tommy is left for last and ultimately not picked at all. And, as it turns out, this whole thing was planned. The other boys orchestrated this in advance, and they laugh at him and walk away, leaving him stranded in the field, alone, unchosen, and ashamed. He begins, predictably, to scream, to shake his fists and rage and curse. Kathy, up to this point a silent onlooker sitting to the side with the other girls, obviously feels for him, and so she approaches Tommy to make sure he's okay. Tommy is surprised by this sudden human contact, and he turns and accidentally strikes Kathy in the face. It might seem like this is a catastrophe, a tragedy before something good could even start, but no, Kathy is kind. She understands. Later, she seeks Tommy out in the cafeteria. He apologizes for hitting her, and she tells him not to worry. She knows it was just an accident. This sequence matters immensely because it helps establish a fact that will be important for the rest of the film. Kathy and Tommy care for one another deeply. In fact, it isn't long before their relationship becomes romantic. A few minutes later, we see that the students are soon to experience one of their favorite things at Hailsham, a sale. Throughout the year, they collect coins. The movie depicts these as buttons, which I personally think is very cute. And every so often, delivery men from the outside world arrive in vans carrying boxes full of trinkets and collectibles that the students can buy with their coins. This is a source of great excitement for the students, and at this particular sale, Tommy decides to buy something for Kathy. He gets her a tape, a cassette with songs by the singer Judy Bridgewater. Kathy is obviously touched by this, and she kisses Tommy on the cheek in return. At this point, the tenor of this exchange is explicitly romantic. Though still only kids, these two do seem to be involved in the kind of relationship that will soon blossom into a more mature love. And so, the film has established one of its main through lines, Kathy and Tommy's romance. Interspersed with the development of this relationship are revelations about the lives of the students. Remember, the film started with a scene of an older Tommy, scarred from something, lying on a surgical table. And throughout the film so far, there has been a sort of lingering, ever-present sense, an atmosphere that suggests that things are wrong, that something is off. Why exactly that is explained to us less than 30 minutes into the film. The children are sitting inside a classroom one day while rain plummets to the earth outdoors, slamming against the windows, and their teacher, Miss Lucy, decides to tell the students, once and for all, what is really going on. She tells them the truth, and she is the vehicle by which we, the viewers, learn that same truth as well. These students, we learn, are not normal humans. They are, instead, clones. They weren't born from human parents, but instead were created in a lab, and their lives are predetermined, already set out for them. They will grow up at Hailsham, and when their time there is finished, they will be moved to another location where they will await the beginning of their donations. When the time is right, each of them will be individually summoned to begin the process of donating their vital organs. And then, after about the third or fourth donation, if not earlier, they will die, and that is it. Their lives will be complete. They have nothing else to hope for. For them, no other future is possible. Remember how I mentioned that the opening shot of the film was Kathy watching Tommy on the operating table? Well, that was mostly true. But there was also an epigraph shown on screen before that. It reads, "The breakthrough in medical science came in 1952. Doctors could now cure the previously incurable." And so, it turns out that these students are the breakthrough. They, themselves, are the very thing that has saved the world. Scientists in the 20th century learned how to clone human beings, and in so doing, they created for themselves an endless supply of healthy organs, ripe for donation. All they have to do is take them, remove them from the living bodies of the clones. And so, the only job these students will ever have is waiting for their turn to give up their organs and die. It goes without saying that this is a massive reveal. It's impossible to overstate how important this is for the characters, and yet, their lives must go on. Remember, right now, they're just kids. We're only about 25 minutes into the movie. They have so much longer to live, and so live they do. Kathy and Tommy still like one another, and we expect that relationship to continue developing. But, unfortunately, this is where things go wrong. Soon, Kathy will spot Tommy and her friend Ruth, our third important character, secretly holding hands. Shortly thereafter, something even worse happens. She sees them kiss beside a fountain. And so, all of a sudden, even after the terrifying reveal about the students' existential condition, the fact that they are clones, that they are destined for nothing more than organ harvesting and death, this love triangle becomes the emotional center of the film. This story, that of Ruth stealing Tommy away from Kathy, is what the movie focuses on. Everything else recedes to the background. We're then greeted with a time skip. Years have passed, and Ruth, Kathy, and Tommy's time at Hailsham is complete. Now, they're moving to a new place called the Cottages, where they will live a life of relative relaxation and ease until they're called upon to begin their donations. At the Cottages, we're introduced to several new characters, students who grew up at schools other than Hailsham, the most important of them being Rodney and Chrissy. And yet, the tension of the love triangle is still there. Ruth and Tommy are still officially a couple, and Kathy is explicit in her desire that they separate, but they don't. There are all sorts of fiercely awkward moments that result from this fact. At one point, Kathy criticizes Ruth for what she sees as her inauthenticity. Ruth, Kathy realizes, has been using many of the same gestures with Tommy as Chrissy does with Rodney. And to make matters worse, Chrissy and Rodney copied those same mannerisms from the television. So, Ruth's behavior is a copy of a copy, and Kathy calls her on it. Ruth responds by saying this.
Oh, Kathy. So that's what this is about. It must be really awful for you, surrounded by all these couples.
There's something so vindictive here, almost malicious. It seems that Ruth really does want to rub it in Kathy's face. I won Tommy, and you didn't. He is my prize. This tension is a constant throughout this section of the film. At one moment, which I won't put on screen for obvious reasons, Kathy walks by Ruth and Tommy's room and is literally witness, through the still open door, to them having some fairly animated sex. Again, the intrusion feels aggressive. It feels planned, crude. Did Ruth leave the door open on purpose? The film makes it very clear to us that this all pains Kathy immensely. To see Ruth, her supposed friend, sleeping with the only man she's ever loved. Now, to be fair, this isn't the only plotline of the film. All sorts of other things happen, and some of them are genuinely moving. There's one sequence in particular I want to talk about, not just because I find it compelling, but because it's important for the movie's ending. As I mentioned, many of the other young adults that Kathy, Tommy, and Ruth encounter at the cottages did not grow up at Hailsham, and that includes Rodney and Chrissy. As it turns out, Hailsham is regarded as a kind of privileged, elite institution, and all sorts of rumors crop up about the place. Eventually, there comes a day when Rodney shares something shocking with Ruth. He claims to have seen, or at least to have maybe seen, Ruth's original, the real, living, breathing human woman from whom she was originally cloned. And so, the group decides to take a trip to see if it really is her. Ruth, Kathy, Tommy, Rodney, and Chrissy all pile into a car and head into the city. But what happens isn't exactly what our three main characters expected. Yes, they do look through the windows of an office building and see the person who might in fact be Ruth's original, but the really striking scene in this sequence happens elsewhere. Before reaching the office, the group stops at a diner to get some food and drinks, and it's here that Rodney and Chrissy share the rumor they've heard. They've been told, by who knows whom, that students from Hailsham are privileged, that they have the secret and private opportunity to defer the beginning of their donations by 3 or even 4 years. The way they do that is by seeking out the right people and proving that they're in love. And what an idea, right? If Rodney and Chrissy's love can be proven, if it can be rendered official, certified by the powers that be, then maybe they can earn some extra time together, several more years in which to settle into the life they've created for themselves. Unfortunately, the rumor isn't true, or at least it isn't one that Kathy, Tommy, and Ruth have ever heard before. And when they break that news to Rodney and Chrissy, their response is predictably tragic. I would recommend watching the movie if only for this scene. It's really powerful, the performances by all the actors are pitch perfect, and it's a moment I'll be thinking about for a long time. In this scene, at least, the movie shines. So, the point is, the movie isn't all about the love triangle, but it is mostly about that. With time, Kathy realizes that Ruth and Tommy will not be separating, and so she decides to volunteer as a carer. Basically, it's a job where she will help other people who have already started their donations work through the process. She will comfort them, advocate for them, and try to make the otherwise grueling and horrifying experience of giving up their literal organs somewhat more bearable. By the time Kathy finishes her training, Ruth and Tommy have split, but it's too late. The three grow apart, and they don't see each other for years. The final act of the film focuses on their reuniting. One day, in the hospital, Kathy happens to casually see Ruth's name appear on a computer screen, and she inquires about her. As it turns out, Ruth has already begun her donations, and she is not doing well. So, Kathy goes to see her, and when she's there, Ruth suggests that they link up, again, with Tommy, who has likewise begun his donations, and whom neither of them have seen since their time at the cottages. So the trio reunite. They go on a trip to see a boat stranded on a beach, and there, Ruth gives her grand speech. She says, to both Kathy and Tommy, that she is sorry for keeping them apart for all these years. She says that she was jealous, that she could tell they had real love and she didn't, and she was afraid of being the odd one left out. But, she says, not all is lost. There's still one thing they can do. Maybe, she says, the rumors about the deferrals were true. Maybe the two of them, Kathy and Tommy, who have always been in love, really can prove that love and get their donations pushed back. And maybe the way they go about proving that love has to do with another mystery from their school days. So, one more quick aside. Another thing the film shows us is that, when they were at Hailsham, the students were routinely expected to produce art. Then, every so often each term, a woman they simply called Madame would show up at the school, collect the best art the students had to offer, and take it to put in her gallery. The meaning of the gallery was never explained. The students weren't even sure if it was real. But now, we finally have a theory. Isn't it true that art, at its core, reveals something about the soul of the artist? That it discloses something essential and true about its creator to the world? So, maybe the art they made for all those years is the evidence of their love. Maybe, if their art is good enough, Kathy and Tommy can prove that they really do love one another, that they deserve the deferral, deserve to live that much longer. Maybe that is the meaning of the gallery. Maybe their art will demonstrate their love is imprinted, like a footprint on the moon, in the very bedrock of their souls. And so, this is the film's final adventure. Ruth has managed to find Madame's current address, and she gives it to Kathy and Tommy, hoping for their success. The two go, and, to make a long story short, things don't work out. What they find is that the deferrals are not real. They never have been. It's a rumor started over and over by students throughout the years, but there's never been any truth to it. They cannot defer their deaths. Tommy will have to undergo his next donation, and Kathy will likely begin hers soon. But what about their art? The gallery? Well, yes, the instructors at Hailsham did collect that art to serve as evidence of a kind, but it wasn't intended to prove anything about the content of their souls. The purpose of the art was to see whether they, these children, these clones, even had souls to begin with. And this, finally, is the ultimate tragedy of the movie. Kathy and Tommy have no time in which to revel in their love. Now that they finally have one another, their time is up. It ended as soon as it began. As you might expect, Tommy undergoes his final operation, and we're finally back where we started. Kathy longingly looking through the glass window of the operating room, a smiling Tommy lying recumbent on the table, and Kathy standing there simply watching as the love of her life has his own life drained from him, his organs removed, sent off to someone else, little bloody gifts destined for recipients who will never truly appreciate the sacrifice it took to get them. And then he dies, and Kathy is alone. By this time, Ruth has already been dead for a while. It's only Kathy now. And so she drives on, and in her narration she tells us that she, too, has finally been summoned for her first donation, which will happen shortly. We know exactly what that means, what it signifies, what lies in wait for her. And then, like that, the movie ends. Okay, so that was a whirlwind of a summary. But I think getting those basic facts on the table, establishing at least the essential components of the story, is helpful with respect to what I want to do next. I want to turn now to the novel itself. Having already summarized the movie, I don't need to re-summarize the story here. What I can do, finally, is start to tell you about all of the enormous, deeply consequential ways in which the movie is completely different from the original text, the things the film adaptation went out of its way to change. So let's spend some time talking about those differences. Then, I'll explain what I think we can make of these divergences, what they do to the story, and why we should care. The biggest point I want to make is that the love triangle that is so central to the movie is simply not the main concern of the novel. It is present, but it is not the novel's emotional center, and there are a lot of ways I could prove this to you. In the film, there are a ton of scenes and details that are not just minorly tweaked, but completely, fundamentally altered, their most essential components stripped away and refashioned. As an example, remember how the film immediately establishes Kathy and Tommy's romance. They are, from their very childhoods, deeply bonded, even in love. In the novel, however, this simply is not the case. Kathy isn't romantically interested in Tommy from a young age. In fact, she dates and has sex with plenty of other men in the novel. She has other relationships, and she thinks about those relationships deeply, but the film simply refuses to show us those moments. To give you a small example, there's a chapter in the novel where Kathy details how the students at Hailsham were taught about sex. Insofar as they are clones, they can't have children of their own, so their sex education doesn't have to deal with all of those oh-so-fun discussions about abstinence or contraception. Instead, their teachers stress to them the importance of having sex with the right person because of what sex can do to your emotions. Eventually, as the students age, they start to explore their own sex lives, and there's a vignette when Kathy realizes that she doesn't want to be left out of the fun. She decides that the time has come. She's ready to have sex, but she needs to find the right person to do it with. And who does she pick? Is it Tommy, her one true love? Does she yearn over him, jealous that another woman, her own friend, gets to sleep with him instead? No, of course not. Tommy doesn't even enter her mind. Instead, she settles on a boy named Harry, and her description of him is, I think, very touching. Here's what she says. I had my eye on Harry C. I chose him for a number of reasons. First, I knew he'd definitely done it before, with Sharon D. Next, I didn't fancy him that much, but I certainly didn't find him sick-making. Also, he was quiet and decent, so unlikely to go around gossiping afterwards if it was a complete disaster. She continues these thoughts later, after we find out that she did not, in fact, go through with it. I still think Harry was a good choice for that stage in my life. I think he would have been considerate and gentle, and have understood what I was wanting from him. This is one of those vignettes that I love. It shows a maturity on Kathy's end to think about sex in this way, and it also shows us her independence from Tommy and Ruth. She isn't sitting by the window, twirling her hair sadly as she ponders the fact that Ruth has stolen Tommy from her. No, she's her own person, and she has her own ideas about the relationship she wants to pursue, the kind of sex she wants to have, and it does not all center around Tommy. I also just love the idea of this Harry character, a boy so sweet, so gentle, that Kathy feels safe having sex with him for the first time, sharing that intimate and personal experience with him, not worried that he will go around spreading rumors if things somehow fall apart. Something about that just strikes me as so sensitive and kind, and I wish we saw more of Harry in the novel. Either way, there are plenty of other scenes like this. There's another moment, for example, when Ruth and Tommy actually do split up when the students are still at Hailsham. And what happens? Does Kathy swoop in, finally faced with the opportunity to make her move? No. In fact, it's almost the opposite. Ruth approaches Kathy and asks if she will help her get back together with Tommy. And does Kathy resist this idea? Once again, no. She immediately agrees. Of course I'll help, she says. On the next page, Kathy worries about Ruth and Tommy's relationship, but not for the reason you might think. She says the following. Ruth, are you serious about Tommy? I mean, if I do persuade him and you get back together, you won't hurt him again? So Kathy is concerned about them getting back together, but not because she wants to occupy Ruth's place. She's concerned that Ruth won't take it seriously enough and they'll break up again. You see just how drastically different this is than the story the film wants to tell. In the movie, it's all about Tommy, all about the antagonism generated by the fact that both Kathy and Ruth want to be with him. But in the novel, that just isn't so. The conflict is entirely imagined, or at least exaggerated, heightened to an extreme it never actually reached in the text. What makes this scene even more interesting is what came right before it. Before Ruth speaks to her, Kathy finds out about Ruth and Tommy splitting up from another student. And after they've split, two different girls, one named Cynthia and the other named Hannah, both suggest to Kathy that now is her chance, that now she can pursue Tommy. Cynthia even calls her Ruth's natural successor. So how does Kathy react to all of this? I'll quote her so you can see. I couldn't help thinking that she represented what anyone with any distance on the subject would think. After all, I'd been Tommy's friend for years until all of this couples stuff had come up. It was perfectly possible that to someone on the outside, I'd look like Ruth's natural successor. The point is, Kathy does not immediately show any romantic interest in Tommy. She says that they've been friends for years, but she does not have time to think of him as a romantic option. It's only someone who's been observing from a distance, from the outside, who might see things that way. Up close, with knowledge of all the details, Kathy simply does not agree. She wants to have sex with Harry. Her mind is set on another boy. She agrees to help Ruth reunite with Tommy, and why shouldn't she? Kathy has other suitors. She's perfectly happy doing her own thing. I could go on and on. I could remind you, for example, of that scene at the beginning of the film, when Kathy approaches Tommy in a field and he turns around in surprise and accidentally hits her. Remember how that panned out? How right afterwards, Kathy approached him in the cafeteria in front of everyone and told him it's okay? Well, it turns out that this is also a major alteration. In the novel, Kathy does approach Tommy in the field. He does accidentally hit her, but what happens next is not at all the same. She doesn't approach him afterwards in the cafeteria. She makes no effort at all to make Tommy feel better about hitting her. No, he approaches her, and she's annoyed by it. By this time in the novel, they're already 13 years old, and Kathy still has no interest at all in Tommy as a romantic partner. When she sees him approaching her in a stairwell, here's what she says. Tommy, who was in the stream coming down, had stopped dead on the stairs with a big open smile that immediately irritated me. A few years earlier, maybe, if we ran into someone we were pleased to see, we'd put on that sort of look. But we were 13 by then, and this was a boy running into a girl in a really public situation. I felt like saying, Tommy, why don't you grow up? This is not the story of two people who have been in love their whole lives, whose love is repeatedly thwarted by the actions and interruptions of other people. Instead, I think this situation is better understood as the story of two people who are friends for a long time before either of them considers the romantic avenue. Because, yes, let's be honest about this much. Kathy and Tommy do get together later in the novel, but it is much later, only when Ruth is dying. And remember, Ruth and Tommy do split up, again, as Kathy is nearing the end of her carer training, but Kathy does not pursue Tommy as a result. They don't see each other for years. It's only later in life, reconnecting, that romantic love is something they consider. As children, they're just friends. Yes, Kathy cares for Tommy, and yes, they do have some sort of intuitive emotional connection, but in the way that good friends do. Sometimes they annoy each other. Sometimes they don't want to hang out. Frequently, they date and sleep with other people. At times, they go weeks without speaking. But the film shows us nothing of this. It's all romance, all the time. One of the tragedies of the film adaptation, I think, is that it fundamentally misunderstands, even eliminates from its scenes altogether, the many great friendships that pepper this story. And I'm not just talking about the friendship between Kathy and Tommy. I'm also talking about the friendship between Kathy and Ruth. By making Tommy a point of contention, Kathy and Ruth are pitted against one another. There's an antagonism between them that is so palpable throughout the film. There are so many wonderful scenes in the book that we never get to witness in the movie. Times when Kathy and Ruth talk about their lives, their hopes, their other friends, and yes, the boys who interest them, and these conversations do not all center around one man. We see them happy, laughing, caring for one another, looking out for each other, protecting each other in difficult situations. We see them, in other words, being friends. But the film makes these two women orbit Tommy. He is the center of their shared universe, and we lose so much as a result. Okay, so I could continue like this for hours. I could list for you scene after scene that is totally, irreducibly changed in the film, but I don't think it makes sense to try to talk about every single one of them. It wouldn't be all that helpful, wouldn't give us a clear view of the situation or help us make a clear argument. We'd be left with too many fragments, and it would be difficult to arrange them into a cohesive, unified image. So just take it as a given that, much like the scenes I just finished discussing, there are lots of other small, minute changes that won't be addressed in this video. There are simply too many, and talking about them all in succession wouldn't serve the conversation I think is worth having. What I'm going to do, instead, is highlight how the novel and the film handle one particular aspect of the story differently, the story of Kathy's tape. This tape, this cassette of songs by Judy Bridgewater, is arguably the most important object in the story. It is literally the source of the story's title. Never Let Me Go is Kathy's favorite song on that tape, the one thing she turns to for comfort and peace of mind. Its importance is impossible to overstate. So, Rather than going scene by scene and talking about every change, I think we can set ourselves up for a much more clear argument by simply investigating the ways in which this singular object is handled by both the novel and the film. In so doing, I think we'll be able to see their essential differences quite clearly. Let's refresh on the story of the tape in the movie. Tommy buys it at a sale and gifts it to Kathy, and she kisses him on the cheek as a way of saying thank you. This serves a clear purpose in the film. It establishes their mutual romantic interest. But how does the novel tell this part of the story? Well, to begin with, Tommy does not gift that tape to Kathy. She finds it for herself at a sale. Tommy has nothing to do with it. Already, this is important. The link between Tommy and the original tape is a complete fabrication of the movie. In the novel, through her narration, Kathy tells us why this tape mattered to her so much. She loved that song, Never Let Me Go, and in particular, she liked one part of it. Rather than summarize, I'll quote her here directly. I just waited for that bit that went, baby, baby, never let me go. And what I'd imagine was a woman who'd been told she couldn't have babies, who'd really, really wanted them all her life. Then there's a sort of miracle and she has a baby, and she holds this baby very close to her and walks around singing, baby, never let me go. Partly because she's so happy, but also because she's so afraid something will happen, that the baby will get ill or be taken away from her. This is what Kathy imagines when she listens to the song, and I think this moment carries an almost unquantifiable significance for the broader narrative. What Kathy is envisioning here is a quintessentially human tragedy. A woman finds that one of her dreams, becoming a mother, is impossible, that it's walled off from her, that her very biology is getting in the way. Already, we see the connection. Remember, these cloned humans can't have children. But then, a miracle. The woman has a baby after all, and in holding it, she feels a deeply complex, deeply human emotion, that tightly woven braid of both passion and terror that is so central to human love. I am overjoyed that you are here, but I am terrified that you might leave. This is such an intimate and complicated feeling, and to see Kathy ruminating on the song in this way humanizes her. It shows us how deep those emotional currents really do run in her soul. Moreover, it's interesting that Kathy herself acknowledges that even at the time, she knew this was a love song, knew it had something to do with adult romance, but she chose to not think about it that way. She doesn't care about romance right now. Here she is in her own words. Even at the time, I realized that this couldn't be right, that this interpretation didn't fit with the rest of the lyrics. But that wasn't an issue with me. The song was about what I said. I just love this moment. Kathy, as a consumer of art, is making an active, willful interpretive decision based on her own emotions. I don't care that this song is about romantic love. To me, right now, it's helping me explore other feelings, and that's how I want to make use of it. This is such an awesome vignette, but the movie completely fails to understand what it's really about. By making this tape a gift from Tommy, a gift so sweet it earns him a kiss in return, the film artificially floods this plotline with romantic implications that simply aren't present in the novel. On the contrary, in the novel, Kathy actively rejects any romantic interpretation of these lyrics. She herself says, "This might be a love song, but I couldn't care less. To me, these lyrics are about something else." And it isn't just this aspect of the story I want to talk about. In the novel, there is an incredibly important scene that follows, and it's another instance where the novel and the film show themselves to be in completely separate worlds. So, here's the scene. One day, Kathy finds herself alone in the dorm, and she decides that this is a good time to listen to her tape. There's something about this privacy that matters to her, and she takes advantage of the fact that no one else is around. What she wants is to sit on her bed quietly and listen to her favorite song. And so, that's what she does. She's sitting there on the bed, holding a pillow against her chest, a sort of stand-in for the imagined child, and her eyes are closed, and she's singing softly as she sways, and then it happens. She realizes, all of a sudden, that she isn't actually alone. Someone is watching her from the doorway, and that person is Madame, the same woman who, every so often, shows up to collect their art. I'd like to quote this part to you in full. It's worth seeing all of it. I froze in shock. Then, within a second or two, I began to feel a new kind of alarm, because I could see there was something strange about the situation. The door was almost half open. It was a sort of rule we couldn't close dorm doors completely except for when sleeping, but Madame hadn't nearly come up to the threshold. She was out in the corridor, standing very still, her head angled to one side to give her a view of what I was doing inside. And the odd thing was, she was crying. It might have even been one of her sobs that had come through the song to jerk me out of my dream. When I think about this now, it seems to me, even if she wasn't a guardian, that she was the adult, and she should have said or done something, even if it was just to tell me off. Then I'd have known how to behave. But she just went on standing out there, sobbing and sobbing, staring at me through the doorway with that same look in her eyes she always had when she looked at us, like she was seeing something that gave her the creeps. Except this time, there was something else, something extra in that look I couldn't fathom. I want to argue that this is one of the most important moments in the entire story. It's a moment when we see not only the depth of Kathy's soul, the depth, that is, of the soul of a clone, but it is also a moment when we see a non-cloned human's response to that depth. This image of Madame standing there in the threshold of the door, watching Kathy sway quietly to a song, holding a pillow tightly to her chest, tears streaming down Madame's face as she is witness to the undeniable humanity of a living creature created in a lab. This is one of the scenes that stuck with me the first time I read the novel. It's so powerful, so moving, and it's another vignette whose importance cannot be overstated. In fact, I know this much is true, and not only because the song Kathy is listening to is what gives the story its title. No, there's another reason I know this moment matters. Because it comes back up later, at the novel's conclusion. Just like in the movie, Kathy and Tommy do seek out Madame at the end of the novel, hoping for a deferral, for a chance to extend their lives. And, like in the film, they find out that that much won't be possible. But there's a moment in the conversation with Madame when Kathy, all these years later, mentions that day again. Kathy essentially says, "I still remember it. Years ago, you watching me as I listened to that song, crying while you watched. Why was that? Why did you cry?" At first, Madame says this, "I was weeping because when I came in, I heard your music. I thought some foolish student had left the music on. But when I came into your dormitory, I saw you, by yourself, a little girl, dancing. As you say, eyes closed, far away, a look of yearning. You were dancing so very sympathetically. And the music, the song, there was something in the words. It was full of sadness." But Kathy isn't satisfied with this answer. She pushes on, shares her own interpretation of the song. She tells Madame about what she had envisioned at the time. The young woman who couldn't have children, finally holding her baby, afraid that it would die. Maybe Madame intuited this vision somehow. Maybe she knew that this is what Kathy was thinking. But no, that's not it. Madame isn't a mind reader. She had her own interpretation. Here, again, are Madame's words. "When I watched you that day, I saw something else. I saw a new world coming rapidly. More scientific, efficient, yes. More cures for the old sicknesses, very good. But a harsh, cruel world. And I saw a little girl, her eyes tightly closed, holding to her breast the old kind world, one that she knew in her heart could not remain, and she was holding it and pleading never to let her go. That is what I saw. It wasn't really you, what you were doing. I know that. But I saw you, and it broke my heart, and I've never forgotten." What an interpretation! Madame is witness to a child, and not just any child, but a clone, expressing the same kind of emotional depth as any other human might express when listening to a sad song. And what she realizes is that her world has changed, that with the advent of human cloning, a new kind of progress has descended upon the earth. But it's a progress that comes with a loss, one that carries a heavy price, a debt that must be endlessly and perpetually repaid. And that price is the exchange of human tenderness, kindness, and gentleness for a world that is, yes, more efficient, less diseased, a world of higher life expectancies. But it is also a world where sentient, self-conscious beings who love and lose and grieve and dance, just like you and I, must be forced to live like this little girl, a girl who can never have children, swaying softly to gentle music, alone in her dorm room, awash in profound emotion, having no idea what kind of violence and exploitation and death await her in the coming years. This is the cost in this imagined world. This is the price of the medical revolution from which the non-cloned humans like Madame directly benefit. And when Madame is made to witness that cost for even a brief moment, it shatters her heart, and she never forgets. Of course she can't forget. She, a living representative of the society that has produced these children, that has brought these beings into the world with the sole aim of enacting a terrible barbarity against their literal flesh, is forced to look at what they've done. She is forced to bear witness, forced to stare into the eyes of the world that she, like other humans who directly benefit, still so desperately clings to. It's a moment when the underbelly is exposed, when the dark secret is brought to light, when a spokesperson from the above world is made to look down and take account of those on whom they so recklessly tread. Look at us down here, beneath your feet, this moment says. Look at us and remember what your happiness and salvation depend upon. Remember that someone else bears the burden while you reap the reward. It is a powerful moment, and a tragic one, and it is a moment I will never forget reading. So let's take stock again, quickly, of what happened in the text. Kathy found herself a cassette that she fell in love with. Madame one day saw her listening to her favorite song on that cassette and wept in response. And then, years later, Kathy asked her what she was thinking, and we get one of the most direct and explicit reflections on the broader social world the characters inhabit in the whole story. So, the big question, what does the movie do differently? Well, we already know that the movie starts by trying to make this an object of romance. Tommy gifts it, Kathy kisses him. But what else is different? As it turns out, the scene of Kathy being caught listening to the music does happen in the film. But who catches her? Madame? No, of course not. The person who sees her listening to the music on that fateful day in the dorm isn't Madame. In fact, it isn't a non-cloned human at all. The person who sees her, of course, is Ruth. It's another awkward moment, another romantically inflected vignette where what we're primarily concerned with is what this means for the love triangle. Does Ruth know that Tommy gave Kathy the tape? Will she make fun of her for dancing alone like that? These are the questions that concern us here, not anything deeper, and so the movie has completed its betrayal of the meaning of this entire narrative arc. Tommy gives the tape to Kathy, and Ruth catches Kathy listening to it. This object is forcefully inserted, like everything else, into the midst of the love triangle. Like everything else, it must have some role to play in the broader romance, must say something about the romantic tension, must contribute something to that endless conversation. And I think it's obvious that we lose a great deal as a result. Not only do we never get to see Madame watching Kathy in the dorm, probably the single most important moment with respect to the novel's broader social concerns, a scene when we ourselves are witness to what happens when humans are forced to confront the reality of the frightening thing they've wrought, the terrible power they now find in their hands. But we also don't get that conversation between Kathy and Madame at the end. Because, well, of course they can't reflect back on that day. In the film, that original encounter never happened. There's more that I could say about this tape, but I think for now, this suffices. There are other details that the movie changes, or rather, deletes entirely. There's a whole second arc about the tape in the novel. Kathy loses the tape, and it is Ruth, not Tommy, who gifts her an alternative tape in its place. Ruth does her best, but the new tape isn't Judy Bridgewater. It's a sweet gesture, but not the same. Years later, when the group takes their trip to the city to find Ruth's original, there's a whole sequence where Kathy and Tommy spend an hour looking through various shops to try to find her another copy of that specific Judy Bridgewater collection of songs, and they do find it. In fact, Kathy finds it, and Tommy buys it for her. In the novel, even these moments are significant, but in the film, they simply don't exist. They're removed because they have nothing more to add, nothing more to contribute to the story the film is telling. The tape has already done its part. It has, like everything else, heightened the tension of the love triangle. And so, we can do away with it now. The film has no use for it anymore. It can be discarded, done away with, all of its myriad implications forgotten and ignored. And though, like I said, there are so many other differences we could discuss between the two texts, I think this alteration is significant enough that it sets us up nicely for the final argument of this video. So that's where I'd like to turn now. In way of conclusion, let's try to wrap all of this up. tie it together into one clear thesis. If I had to articulate to you, in a single sentence, my argument regarding what the film adaptation does to the original text, I would say that it inverts the narrative power structure inherent in the novel. What I mean is that, in the novel, there's a certain relationship that exists between 1. The broader narrative of the student's existential condition, and 2. The more intimate narrative of their day-to-day lives. And what I would argue is that, in the novel, the second of these, their day-to-day existence, serves to bolster and heighten the tension of the first, the conditions of their existence. It is precisely in showing us that these children are just like us, that they do have souls, that they make friends and have fights and disagree and have sex. It is by having them do these things in all of the same ways we do that we come to appreciate just how horrible it is for the world they live in to reduce them to, basically, organ containers. How is that fair? They make art, they listen to music, they dream. To me, the novel's main story, what it really wants to leave us with, is a reflection on its broader social narrative, and the way it accomplishes that is by showing us the everyday. All of the romance, all of the love in the novel is really a vehicle for the character's humanization. By the time I reach the conclusion, there is no doubt in my mind at all that these people are, well, people. They have souls undeniably, and the depth of their longing for one another is deeply affecting. So, when I have to watch them die, I grieve for them, just like I would for any other human being. And what I think the movie does, on the contrary, is flip that power structure on its head. Rather than the everyday narrative serving to heighten the broader existential narrative, what the film tries to accomplish is the exact opposite. Here, it isn't the fact that the students are clones that we care about the most. No, we care about the love triangle more than anything. That is what the movie wants to center. The larger story about the condition of their existence only serves to heighten the intensity of the romantic tragedy. The fact that they are clones and will have to begin their donation soon means that there is a time limit on when the real romance can be consummated. Kathy and Tommy only have so much time, and we're asked to root for them, to hope they'll be able to manage it, to love one another before the final grain of sand sends in the glass. And so, when things fail in the end, what we grieve is not the very essence of their condition, the fact of who and what they are, but simply the fact that they didn't get a chance to love one another fully, that they didn't have enough time. That, according to the film, is the real tragedy. And so, in service of that tragedy, all of the other relationships that Kathy has during her life must be removed. Her only focus can be Tommy. All of the times that she shows us that she is not interested in him romantically must be erased. The story of the tape? Forget its true implications. Change Madame to Ruth, make the tape originate with Tommy, and thereby make it an object of romantic tension. Don't show the scenes where Ruth asks Kathy to help her and Tommy get back together, and don't show the scenes that make it clear to us that Ruth and Kathy really are good friends, that their friendship is not predicated on a mutual desire for the same man. No, get rid of all of that. Give us romance all the time, and make that our central concern. What is lost here, I think, is a certain metaphor, a comparison that runs throughout the text. In the novel, Kathy mentions multiple times the feeling of being a spider. By my count, she mentions this at least 3 times in the text. She has the feeling not only that she is different, but that the non-cloned humans are disgusted by her and the other students, repulsed in the same way I am when I see a spider. And in fact, in the novel, this feeling is corroborated, proven to be right. Miss Emily, the head guardian at Hailsham and the woman who, Kathy and Tommy find out, lives with Madame, says this much openly to Kathy when she and Tommy come hoping for a deferral. "We're all afraid of you," she says. "I myself had to fight back my dread of you all almost every day I was at Hailsham. There were times I'd look down on you all from my study window and I'd feel such revulsion." This sense that the students are set apart, not only exploited by the world but also hated by it, that they disgust the world at the same time that they save it, really just isn't present in the film, and that's because the film does not care about centering any story of their actual condition. Never mind that they are clones, that they are treated like spiders. Focus on the love triangle at all costs. Let me give you one final piece of evidence in case you aren't convinced. There's something the film has Kathy say in her narration at the very end that I think is a genuine betrayal of the novel's intended story. Right at the end, when we know that Ruth is dead, that Tommy is dead, and that Kathy is soon to begin her donations, the film has Kathy say this: "We all complete. Maybe none of us really understand what we've lived through, or feel we've had enough time." Now, to be fair to the movie, there is some ambiguity here. When Kathy says we, does she mean all of the clones, or all humans in general, including the non-clones? There's some room for disagreement, but I do think it's clear that Kathy means everyone, not just clones. We already know that all of the clones will complete. This is their euphemism for dying, by the way. So, having Kathy say that right at the end, as her final claim, doesn't really make sense. It's information we already have. I think, instead, we're supposed to read Kathy here as saying something along these lines. Everyone dies, not just clones. We all live temporally limited lives, and we should reflect on that fact. And here's the thing. That is true, and it is somewhat touching. It's a way of universalizing the story, reminding us that we all will one day die, and it's therefore important that we appreciate and pursue love in our life when we can, just like Kathy tried to do with Tommy. But the reason I consider this a betrayal of the novel's intended story is that it seems to forget everything that really does make these clones different. Remember, the thing that's unique about their experience isn't just that they're going to die, it's that even in the meantime, they have no say in the matter. They aren't free. They can't pursue careers, can't travel the world, and they certainly aren't allowed to do things like smoke or drink alcohol. They're required to keep their bodies pure and wait around until their time is called. They can't have children, and they can't opt out of the donations, can't refuse the theft of their own organs. They aren't free like we are, and that is what makes them different. That and the fact that the world treats them like spiders. But the movie tries to flatten out this difference at the end, to eliminate it in service of some bland, generic reflection on love and time, and I have to be honest, I'm just not convinced. The film tells us we're all haunted by mortality. We're all in the same boat. And while that is technically true, I just don't think it captures what's really important here. So that's my argument. In its inversion of the novel's narrative structure, its reversal of what the novel chooses to emphasize, what it marks as its emotional center, the film loses a great deal, and to me, its ending falls flat. Okay, I think I'm going to stop here. This video ended up significantly longer than I originally planned, and though I do feel like I could go on, I imagine you get the point. This kind of case study is, in my opinion, interesting and fun. It's fascinating to see how filmmakers take a story and change it, rework its textures and its grooves. But sometimes, for some viewers, it just doesn't work, and for me, this is one of those times. As I mentioned at the beginning, I'm not someone who thinks that novels are always better than their film counterparts. Sometimes I do think the movie adaptation succeeds beautifully, sometimes even more so than the book, and I plan to talk about examples of this kind of successful adaptation in a future video. But for now, let's leave it here. If you take anything from this video, I hope it's simply that Never Let Me Go is a beautiful story. I can't recommend the novel enough, and I'd encourage everyone to read it. The movie is, yes, significantly different, but it is also worth watching, and I could see why some viewers might prefer it. That isn't the case for me, but if it is for you, tell me why. I know that lots of people really like this adaptation, so I'd be curious to hear what you have to say. My view is that, while the novel and the film have the same title and the same characters, they are telling us remarkably different stories. If you disagree or feel that I missed something, feel free to let me know. Otherwise, thanks for watching.